Hello, hello. I am Sinner, and I am doing another review of another book in the Nicomachean Ethics. Book 4, Other Moral Virtues. Um, this one's basically the same as Two Virtues, except it just goes on to talk about more virtues, unsurprisingly. It mainly concerns itself first with virtues to do with money, and then virtues to do with social interaction. So it starts talking about how you ought to be liberal, how you ought not to care too much about money. You shouldn't be stingy, but you shouldn't be prodigal. And prodigal is when you're prodigal, you spend too much, right? And then you try and get money from the wrong places, type of thing. And I think there's something interesting about it because one of the things that starts to pop up in this book is you start seeing him talk about um, with some virtues, the mean is the virtue, but the excess or the deficiency, one is better than the other. So in this one, he says like being prodigal is better than being like stingy because generally speaking, um, like if you covet money too much, that's a bigger problem than someone who doesn't spend their money right. It's an easier fix, so to speak. And then he goes and talks about money for a while, and it's interesting. And he talks about um, magnificence as well. So there's like being liberal, which is like when you spend your money the right way. It's the type of stuff like you'd shout your friends a beer, you would um, not care too much if something costs a little too much. Like, for example, if you're on holiday, this is a good example. If you're on holiday in an Asian country and there's a lot of poor people, you know, don't worry about giving them overspending on like the shirt that you bought that's clearly like 50 cents, but you've spent like $5 on it. That's being a liberal person because you're not actually concerning yourself too much with this sort of stuff because it's sort of below you. Whereas if you're this petty type, then if you're illiberal, then you're the type of person to spend 20 minutes haggling with some Thai lady because you want to buy the shirt for $1 as opposed to $5 or whatever, right? And then there's magnificence, which is liberality, but in regards to things like public works. So it seems to be that it's almost like the Greeks see, or at least Aristotle sees things like public works or the ability to do them as sort of like a prize or a good thing, right? So if you're rich, and you're liberal, it would be assumed that, oh, you're the type of guy to build infrastructure for everyone. You're the type of guy to build something cool that everyone can enjoy, right? Which I think is true. It's genuinely virtuous. Magnificence is the term they use for it, but with all of the virtues, often there's like a Greek word for it which doesn't quite correlate. And then he talks about magnanimity, magnanimity, magnanimity. I think I said it right the first time. And that's about sort of honor, and the right person acknowledges his honor, whereas um, the wrong person either gives himself honor that he doesn't have or hides his honor too much. And typically, like, it seems that magnanimity is something that, like, you don't see like a deficiency in magnanimity as much as you see people having a vanity, like an excess in honor, when they shouldn't. And there's a quote in here which I like, so I'll read it out to you. Besides, he could not be worthy of honor if he were bad, because honor is the prize of virtue, and is rendered to the good. So magnanimity seems to be a sort of crown of the virtues, because it enhances them and is never found apart from them. This makes it hard to be truly magnanimous, because it is impossible without all-round excellence. Good quote. He then talks about anger, how you should be, you know, if you're angry at the right people at the right time, it's because you have self-respect and all that sort of stuff. Whereas if you let people walk all over you, that's kind of cringe. It's cowardly even. And he talks about irascibility, which is a not a virtue because you get too easily angered. And he talks about how some people get angry quickly, but then because they get angry quickly, they stop being angry after the fact. And then there's some people who hold like bitter resentment and they hold on to their anger for a lot longer and it's harder to deal with them, which is true. And then he continues to talk about relations with other people, for example, um, amiability, being friendly. If you're too friendly, if you're like a flatterer and you are always trying to please people, that's bad because you're sort of like I don't know how to describe it. You're a bit of a loser, you're the type of guy who's sort of spineless and isn't willing to actually stand up for what he believes in and these sorts of things. It's sort of bad. But obviously if you're the opposite of that, right? If you're sort of like boorish, if you're like blunt and in a way that's alienating and kind of not mean but unnecessarily antisocial, that's also you shouldn't be doing that either, obviously, because then you're making friends or you're making enemies for no reason. You're making trouble, strife for no reason. And one other thing is when he then talks about truth, and you start to see this thing again with the some excesses or some deficiencies are better or worse than others. And he talks about truth and being truthful. And he talks about it first in response to personal quality. There are people who obviously boast about personal quality that they don't have and or exaggerate it. And then there's people who depreciate their own personal quality. And in both of these cases, he says that the mean, which he labels the individualist, is the guy in the middle who is honest about his strengths and weaknesses, right? But he says that if you're going to be in excess or deficiency, it's better to be the person who he calls ironical, or ironic, who self-depreciates himself because the underlying reason people boast is for personal gain or to make themselves feel better about themselves. It's all for selfish reasons, right? Whereas if someone is self-depreciating, they're not doing it for malicious reasons, typically, besides perhaps looking to not be offensive, I guess, is the only thing I can think of. And I would agree with that. He also then goes to talk about being comedic and how, obviously, again, with this idea of the mean, if you are trying to make a joke out of everything and everyone all the time, you're a buffoon and you're insensitive and you're sort of rude. Whereas if you can't take a joke and you never make jokes, you're like a sour, stale person. And it's not fun to hang around, right? Because according to Aristotle, interaction, conversation is a form of relaxation and entertainment, which is true. And this type of thing ought to be managed well. And he ends it with saying that like modesty is not a virtue. It is a good only as a curb for youthful indiscretion. That's sort of what he ends other virtues on. And it's this idea that, as far as I can tell, modesty is sort of a reaction to immodesty type of thing. Or that modesty is only something that exists with the youth, and it's like a curve. I didn't really get it. I thought it was a bit weird. And he does make a good point at the end, though, that feeling shame isn't necessarily a virtue, because in order to feel shame, you have to do something wrong. He does note that it's a good in the sense that um, it's better than feeling shameless, right? And I would agree. It's like feeling guilty. If you feel guilty, it means you've done something done something wrong in order for you to feel guilty, right? So in a sense, feeling guilty isn't really good in and of itself. It's only good insofar as it's a reaction to something bad. And I guess I can agree with that. I will say this about modesty. I think I disagree. And the reason I disagree is because modesty is, in my opinion, it's like sort of humility, right? Or being an individualist, being honest or being sincere, right? In the same way, you wouldn't want someone who constantly covets attention, constantly is looking for attention. People see that as sort of cringy, bad, and they're right to think that way. You shouldn't you shouldn't treat coveting or constantly desiring attention as a good thing. And immodesty, I think, is the desire to covet attention using your body, right? So wearing things that are improper, not because it's for whatever reason, but just because you want the attention from others that you get from um, wearing those sorts of clothes. And I guess that's what now that I'm thinking about it, that's what he means when he's saying it's a curb for youthful indiscretion, right? Because if you had older people who weren't, you know, lusty, I don't know, I will use that word, I guess, then if you were to dress immodestly, people just wouldn't look at you, right? If you had moral people, you wouldn't need to dress modestly. But because we live with youthful people who are lusty, you have to dress modestly. Okay, that makes sense now. Never mind. I changed my mind. I've changed my mind. I can understand that point of view, but I would still disagree because his point of view makes more sense now, but I think I disagree because I still think it's a virtue in account of the reason that modesty, immodesty can be done for the desire of others, like for the desire to be seen by others, rather than for any sort of counterbalance for other people's indiscretion. And I think a good example of this would be like athletic clothing, like for example, surfers. I surf, and when you wear a wetsuit, you wear like this skin tight, like rubber suit, and you can see your whole form on the suit, but no one would call a wetsuit immodest because, well, not because it covers your whole body, it kind of shows your whole body in a way. But the reason it's not immodest is because you're not wearing it for the purpose of being seen by others. You're wearing it for the purpose of staying warm in the water, right? So I think I would sort of disagree. I can understand that point of view, but I would sort of disagree. And one last thing before I end this little review, my little thoughts, is that I've got one subscriber now. Woohoo! First subscriber ever. Let's go. I'm happy about that. But yeah, anyway, thank you for watching. I am Sina, and I will see you later.